Now we are coming to the last topics on non-verbal information, in this case the multimodal action of users. So social relationship is a topic that I have already addressed in the beginning of this week's lectures. It is signaled multimodally, as I repeatedly said, but here's another example that I have not mentioned before, and this is that the quality of a relationship can be seen by the way how strongly people are in training on each other and how much they mimic each other. So for example, in an intimate relationship, or if they really like each other, typically people tend to mimic or entrain on each other. You all know this from speed dating, for example, that can be analyzed, and if one person makes a certain gesture, the other sometimes unconsciously, sometimes consciously mimics this gesture. Or if you're sitting in the lecture room or at dinner, people tend to lean on the table like this, and after a while certain people will follow. This is not totally synchronous, but after a while, if the group belongs together or if a couple is engaged, they will tend to exhibit similar posture, for example. This will change back again. So leaning back, one people starts, others will follow. And if you have a fast forward of a video of people, you can see this quite clearly. So there are other ways to entrain. For example, even in speech, this is observed. So the wording, the use of words, also syntactic structure, tend to be repeated and gets more similar over time. We know this also from non-verbal information, for example in voice, that certain patterns of, for example, speech tempo will be more similar in a conversation than of people who are not in a conversation. Of course, this is not a process that cannot be controlled. For example, if you really dislike a person, you will tend, for example, to show your distance by not engaging in this kind of procedure or process. Another example is social dominance. I already gave some examples how you can detect social dominance in people's interaction. For example, people who have high social status and high dominance tend to interrupt others more frequently. And they also tend to touch, although this might be not the real circumstance for doing that. Also, there's a pattern of people disrespecting the private space that I talked about if they have higher social status. This is not necessarily so, but there are significant trends if you observe people engaged. Also, social dominance can be seen by or is exhibited by louder speech, fewer backchanneling, and I already talked about the gaze pattern distribution of people with same or different social status. For example, diverging from the pattern that listeners tend to gaze longer to the speaker, whereas speakers do not gaze that much to the listeners. As a summary, Mehrabian, one pioneer in this field, identified three basic dimensions of social signals. So one is the overall evaluation, whether people are intimate, whether people like each other. And I already said that this mimicking or entrainment is a signal for a positive evaluation. But also in general, more eye contact, closer distance, more touching, and an orientation of the body and torso towards each other is a signal of a positive evaluation of the other. And then there is relaxation, which is related to status. So this is not about being totally relaxed in a very private situation, but if you see signs of relaxation in people who are not in a really close, intimate or private situation, this is often a signal or a sign that this person has a high social status and also is quite self-assured, self-confident as well. And then the last dimension is activity. And here I mean the attentiveness, the concentration of the other. And this is signaled, for example, by a tall or forward-directed posture, movements of the body parts, of course nodding, facial expressions, and also the prosody, which I talked about in voice. I often said that all these signals, these nonverbal signals, and their meaning is culturally dependent. This is especially true for iconic gestures, like these index gestures which we have learned. For example, this one that I just display here. This could be just a normal one, but it could also be interpreted as highly vulgar. As a summary, there is a kind of taxonomy of dimensions to separate different cultures from each other. I will go these 5 dimensions one by one and give an example. So, for example, there are high contact versus low contact cultures. And this means people touch each other more, have a smaller personal space and smaller distances. And this is, for example, true for Southern European cultures compared to Northern European cultures. Then we have collectivism versus individualism. So this is more about showing politeness and keeping the group, the face of each person intact for the more collectivism cultures, and compared to, or as opposed to showing your personal characteristics and aspects. And for example, we have here the example of certain Asian cultures or Central European cultures. Then we have a language-related dimension. This is high context versus low context cultures. This means that with context, this means that the speech is actually referring to a certain social context. For example, low context would, high context would mean that there are more indirect speech acts. And here again we have Germany as a low context culture compared, for example, to France, French cultures and Arabic cultures. Then, as a 4th one, there is the power distance. So showing your own power or showing not your social power. And here we have Denmark, for example, as a culture where this display of power is not that common, versus India or some Indian cultures. And the last one is in older textbooks called masculine versus feminine cultures. That is not up to date anymore because this is highly stereotypical. Actually, this is about favoring and showing success versus favoring and showing that you have a good life and a good, for example, work-life balance. I want to give the example of Sweden compared to Germany. If you like, for example, Swedish criminal stories, the detective typically is a nice guy, and this is illustrated by him or her having a nice house, wooden house at a lake where he or she can rest. This is not that typical for the German policemen or detectives. So why bother at all? All these non-verbal signals are multimodal, and they are used for people who are engaged in any kind of interaction. And if we want to build social actors like social robots or social companions that are involved and integrated in our daily social life, then we might make use of these social signals that I talked about. It would be nice to have such an intelligent system that is able to actually detect if a user is putting his or her attention towards the system or not. And also to even display or synthesize these kind of signals as well. So, for example, turn taking might be nice for a conversation as in speech. Or if you have a multi-party system that can deal with groups because it offers information, for example, then it should know when people are engaged in conversation with themselves or when they are addressing the system. The last point that I have here is about using these kind of effects to see whether people are responding appropriately to such social actors or social systems. So if they show normal or typical behavior, they would also show engaged in a human-human conversation or interaction, then you would have clear indication that the system is treated as a social actor. Maybe not as a human, but as a social actor. And if this was your development goal, then you have a positive feedback on that.